Looking closer at the reformed TSCA, there are certain patterns that one can observe in terms of the intent and objective of devising a safer inventory at the end of the process and the point of departure, which is the former TSCA inventory. So you see that there's interim steps between the two points, and that is the step number one, which is the reset, number two, prioritization, number three, risk evaluation, and finally the risk management. And I will talk about this in little more detail in subsequent slide, but I just want to outline to you the fact that between 2016 and currently 2020, there have been a lot of frameworking rules that have been developed, and many of these have been already implemented. And there's some that still have to be finalized, but we are well underway in terms of the implementation of the reformed TSCA. The practical aspects of the reformed TSCA are that after the very vigorous initial framework rulemaking and implementation, now we are at the point that the first 10 high priority chemical risk evaluations have been largely completed. And we are entering into the next phase, which is the continuous cycling by rule of 20 low priority substances, or LPS, and then 20 high priority substances at any one time. So what it means to the regular community is that there's necessarily vigilance that's required to make sure that whoever is in charge of monitoring TSCA developments and compliance needs to stay on top of things. And things move pretty quickly. Throughout this repeating cycle, there's numerous commenting opportunities on some of the EPA's deliverables, documentation. There's also the requirement that some of these risk evaluations will be subject to fee recovery. And I'll talk about that also later in this presentation. And also there's opportunity for the industry to provide information to influence any rulemaking or some of these deliverables that EPA is issuing. So in all, this is a very interactive and evolving in terms of the nature of the new TSCA. One of the steps I showed you in the previous slide was the filter, whittling down of number of former inventory TSCA constituents, and this is what's called the inventory reset. That process has been completed, and here are some of the statistics that currently, the current TSCA inventory, there's about 50-50 split between the inactive chemicals and then active chemicals. And some of the features of those former TSCA inventory chemicals is that with that notice or activation thereof, they're simply not allowed in US commerce or importation. On the flip sides, those that were designated as active, they are in lawful status for their use, importation, providing they comply with the original uses as registered. And then those are the chemicals, the rest of them in that active inventory pool that will be subject to subsequent prioritization and risk evaluation cycles. And also from the practical perspective, the regular community should keep on checking whether their chemicals in active commerce do indeed have the active status associated with them. So here are some of the practical aspects. The inventory checking can sometimes be a little challenging because your initial search for some of the chemicals may not identify a match. But this is not something that necessarily is due because the chemical is brand new to US commerce, but it may be very likely that it's an exempt or it's claimed as confidential, or they could simply be a naming or a CAS issue. So further investigation would be appropriate before taking any more actions. Now, there's a standard of what information can be found and even reported is the standard of reasonably known ascertainable, or in other words, what would one be expected to possess, control, or know? There's also the other aspect that's practical is that if you did go through the inventory reset, you are required to keep your forms in your records for 5 years. So that's the housekeeping requirement. Looking at that, the next step is the prioritization cycle. There's certain features that are worth noting is that it's a continuous process. And some of the criteria for including any one chemical as high priority or a candidate as high priority is its hazardous nature, persistence, bioaccumulative properties, and necessarily toxicity. But there's another interesting aspect of this is that the conditions of use is also considered, which is an attractive feature because the industry can provide feedback to EPA to tell them that although they may be persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, but due to the particular nature of the use, they really are not in contact receptors. So that's a very important aspect, the pragmatic aspect in this prioritization step, and this opportunity to influence that. So here are some of the summary feature of the 20 high priority substance list. Interesting component of that is that the costs are not considered in determining what is a high priority. And once those chemicals are identified as high priority, they directly fed into the risk evaluation stage. And because it's a screening level type assessment, those evaluations in terms of the prioritization are conservative. They look at the susceptible populations, and they could be, of course, depending the results of risk evaluation, they could be subject to risk management or even bans in some severe cases. What's a little more complicated is for the low priority substances. Essentially, what the industry has commented on is that there's relatively high bar to any one chemical being designated as a low priority. Another aspect is that once, which is attractive aspect as well, is that once a chemical is indeed designated low priority, they will not go into the risk evaluation phase. Nevertheless, low priority substances can be called into the high priority evaluation at any time. So this is not a final designation. Some of the practical aspects of the prioritization, it's really good to constantly monitor EPA's prioritization pipeline. In particular, if there's anything on their high priority list potentially, and those happen to be mission or process specific critical chemicals, it'd be worthwhile to pay further attention and possibly influence the decision making. And also one of that influencing characteristics that you may be able to provide information to better inform EPA on its conditions of use. There's also a high interest in low priority designations because these could be the low impact replacement chemistries that might be, of course, they will be less likely to be regulated. So that could be something of use. Real quick overview of the risk evaluation. It's a fairly complex process, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This slide is really just for your awareness that there's other aspects of TSCA. I talked about the overall scope in terms of the continuous high priority, low priority cycling. I talked about the approach of using the science, weight of evidence-based systematic reviews. And then there's certain milestones that one needs to be looking for. Is the scoping documents, the problem formulation documents, and that's where the information gathering is taking place. At the end of the risk evaluation cycle, which can take up to 3.5 years, there will be certain assessments, conclusions, and public disclosures made in terms of the need and nature of the risk management. Something that's actually current, and I will talk about it later in this video, is that the risk evaluation process is very costly, millions of dollars. I've seen figures, and those fees will be recovered from the manufacturers and importers, and in some type of divisive way. But I'll touch upon those later on, so stay tuned. In terms of the overview of the practical aspects, again, you have some bullets you can refer to at your leisures, but I think it's worthwhile to look a little deeper in those risk evaluation documentation to make sure that what EPA is looking at is consistent with the real world scenarios in the way these chemicals are actually used. So that's critical. And then also another heads up that if you are somehow involved with the first 20 high priority substances identified by the EPA, and EPA even went as far as identifying some of the business entities that may be linked to these chemicals, you have a requirement to self-identify if you're not on the list by March 27th of this year.